1965. North Vietnam prepares for total war. Infiltration of northern soldiers into the South increases dramatically.
Et maintenant, Charleston, présenté également par le groupe chorégraphique du Moulin Rouge.
Saigon, 1965. Fun capital of a country at war. It is a bizarre contrast to the gunfire just moments away. Americans questioned the determination of their South Vietnamese ally. The American military, led by General William Westmoreland, takes over the war. The U.S. sends 500,000 troops. Their strategy is attrition. Kill more soldiers than North Vietnam can afford to lose.
We're still looking beatings through the bush. We estimate there were 3 to 5 of them, over. Hey, Doc, patch him up. What'd you say, Sheriff? The other one had gray cast. This guy's a local force type. He claims there were 30 NVA with him. Be careful, though. If there are 30 of them out there and you make contact, you'll have a fight on your hands, over.
Freedom was in jeopardy, and a struggling people had been brought almost to their knees by aggression when William Westmoreland was called to urgent duty. His mission was to deny aggression its conquest. It was a mission simple enough to state. But to execute that mission, he had to fight the most complex war in all American history.
Between 1965 and 68, the period of maximum U.S. combat involvement, the conduct of the ground war is the responsibility of General William Westmoreland, Westy to his troops.
Our mission was to protect South Vietnam from being overwhelmed by the aggressive forces from the north. And I was told by Mr. McNamara on innumerable occasions that I should ask for the troops I felt needed to bring about that end result. And that I should not worry about the public opinion, I should not worry about the economy, I should not even concern myself as to the availability of the troops.
March 1965. The first American combat troops, 3,500, land at Da Nang. Their initial mission is to defend U.S. air bases. But as the U.S. bombs the north and the communists attack air bases in the south, General Westmoreland then requests more combat troops.
The strategy that had been enunciated by Washington at that time was through the use of air power, the graduated response. It was essential that our airfields be secure. We had sufficient instance to convince me that since the strategy was dependent on those airfields, we could not totally depend on the Vietnamese to defend them. The initial ground troops were asked for to defend key airfields.
In 65, the main U.S. air bases are at Da Nang in the north, at Quy Nhon and Bien Hoa near Saigon, and at Cam Ranh Bay on the coast.
Now, once those troops were at those bases, it made no sense at all to have them dig in and go strictly in on the defensive. In addition to that, this is very injurious to the morale of your troops because they realize that they're sitting ducks to be attacked based on the initiatives of the enemy, who selects the time and place of attack. And therefore, they are sitting ducks to become very vulnerable. This is basic to anybody who's had any military experience, has any understanding of military tactics.
Some policymakers argue for a cautious military strategy, saying the defense of these bases or enclave positions is enough. Presidential advisor Kenneth Galbraith.
Then the enclave policy, which was perhaps the most popular solution with which I was identified, was that we just pull back and wait, and eventually some sort of a negotiated solution would emerge. In the meantime, there wouldn't be very many lives lost, either on our side and the countryside, and that time would work its own solution.
To surrender the initiative to the enemy and to dig in encaves on the defensive was, in my opinion, a self-defeating procedure.
In 1965, the South Vietnamese Army is losing the war. It numbers 500,000 men. This is 5 times the size of the communist force. But it is poorly motivated and poorly led.
The Vietnamese were losing about a battalion a week. Battalion after battalion was being destroyed by virtue of the North Vietnamese troops, or the so-called Viet Cong main force troops.
But in Saigon nightclubs, everything's coming up roses. As American aid pours in, a luxurious lifestyle develops within earshot of the war. At base camp, the Americans fight the day's battles each night over a 15-cent beer. The Officers' Club of the Helicopter Support Company. Outside, the temperature is 95. Inside, it is air-conditioned. The music is always stateside.
Well, sir, it's quite an operation we have today, wasn't it?
After the nightly movie, the talk usually centers on the war, on the action hours earlier.
Good job. I saw you splatter one right in the back with a rocket.
Roger got lucky again.
That was a lucky shot, number, really.
Blew the other one about 10 feet. I got the other 2 with the machine guns. Yeah, it's very satisfying to know that sometimes you do kill people with these things.
In 1965, there is confidence that the war can be won. The first U.S. combat troops are pouring in. And politically, the U.S. now feels it has a reliable ally. A military council takes power in mid-65. There's a new prime minister, Air Marshal Nguyen Cao Ky. Premier Ky is a tough, flamboyant figure. He heads the 10th government in 20 months. The U.S. military commander, General Westmoreland.
Ky had a lot of charisma. He had a flair, and he was well liked by the troops, and very well liked by the Vietnamese. He was a man of action, swashbuckle, but at the same time, he was highly intelligent.
Premier Ky fully supports the increasing U.S. combat commitment in South Vietnam.
I think it's normal that when Vietnam, as a part of free world country, was attacked by communists, with the Chinese at that time and Russian behind them. So I think it's a duty of America to come for rescue.
Westmoreland's main tactic is called search and destroy. The intention is to locate communist main force units in the jungle and fight them.
We've run into quite a bit of riot.
The Vietnamese tactic is ambush, quick engagement, and quick retreat. According to the Vietnamese, the Americans have bogged down. Hanoi strategist Ha Van Lao.
Le GI est un combattant.
The GI was a fighter who we believed had a certain technical and theoretical education.
Formation technique et théorique. Il était très bien équipé.
He was very well equipped and trained. Nevertheless, even though he was a fighter in an army as sophisticated as the American Army, he did not adapt easily to the conditions of war in Vietnam.
Dans les conditions de la guerre au Vietnam, en particulier dans la jungle.
Particularly in the jungle, in the swamps and the countryside. He was so heavily equipped that he could not move around easily and made himself a vulnerable target for our guerrillas.
As the infiltration from the north increases, Westmoreland requires more and more reinforcements. By mid-1966, his first year in command, he gets almost 300,000 combat troops. When communist units are located, massive firepower is brought in. Within minutes, fighter bombers can reach any area. Naval firepower. Destroyers can hit targets 23 miles inland. Westmoreland develops a new tactic called fire-base support. These are hilltop artillery positions. From these, combat patrols move within range of the supporting fire. Westmoreland is under intense political pressure to reduce his combat casualties. Field units can call for swift evacuation. Using medevac or ambulance helicopters, the wounded are lifted direct from combat zones to base hospitals. Westmoreland's multi-purpose helicopter war greatly reduces troop losses. For the seriously wounded, the survival rate is twice that of the Korean War.
1-4! Give me emergency medevac.
Every type of surgery is close to the combat zone. The communists, too, remain close to the battle. And with their sanctuaries in neutral Laos and Cambodia, they can choose when to fight. Their strategy is to outweight America.
I've had 3 meetings with Ambassador Bunker and 3 with General Westmoreland. I had coffee with him at length this morning, just before I came here. Our American people like when we get in a contest of any kind, whether it's in a war or an election or in a football game or what it is, they want it decided and decided quickly and get in or get out, and they like for that curve to rise like this, and they like for the opposition to go down like this.
Despite President Johnson's public show of optimism, his cabinet is divided. Defense Secretary McNamara has serious doubts. He wants to stop raising the troop level. The bombing of North Vietnam is still Johnson's main strategy. He again increases the airstrikes. The North, in turn, intensifies the ground war, and Westmoreland again requests more troops.
Because of the intelligence that we were receiving on the movement of North Vietnamese troops from north to south and the general buildup of the enemy forces. From the standpoint of myself, the military commander responsible on the scene, if we had not responded to that buildup, we could have found ourselves fighting with odds against us.
Each side responds with more troops. October '66, another 15,000 troops are welcomed ashore. Within days, there will be fighting in the remote highlands. Westmoreland now commands 350,000 troops, and on his recommendation, Johnson agrees to a huge increase. Within a few months, there will be 500,000. By now, America's Pacific allies are in the war. South Korea sends 45,000 troops. Thailand sends a volunteer infantry regiment. The Philippines dispatches a 2,000-man civic action team. The Australians, the first to arrive, increased their combat force to 7,000 troops. New Zealand dispatches a 500-man artillery battery.
And when forces were committed, I tried to put enough force, put enough military power into the effort that would assure success, but also minimize casualties.
In 1965, Westmoreland is Time Magazine's Man of the Year. The U.S. forces are steadily taking over the war. The strategy calls for the Saigon government to build a nation.
Get them all and collect everything. There's a lot of gear in here. We want it all.
In February 1966, Key is invited to meet President Johnson. After the constant change of leadership, Key and his wife, Mai, provide an image of stability. As Key leaves Saigon, his priority is to get more economic aid. President Johnson enthusiastically agrees. He wants victory in what he calls the other war. In Hawaii, Johnson tells Key, "We are here to talk peace. We are determined to win not only military victory, but victory over hunger, disease, and despair." Key gets dramatic evidence of American support. He asks for a television network to promote social reforms. Within a month, TV has come to Vietnam. To fight the economic war, the U.S. in 1966 commits $750 million in road-building materials and equipment, in iron and steel products, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and vehicles of every kind. He and his wife provide the military regime with a populist image. He demonstrates style and conscience. He even warns his fellow generals against corruption in their own families. America is pleased, but according to Key, the American aid is also a corruptive influence.
Vietnam was poor. Vietnamese people are poor. So, of course, when 500,000 American soldiers were present in the soil of Vietnam, they brought with us a living condition that, compared to the Vietnamese living conditions, is so high, you know, so comfortable, that in many ways it corrupted.
Items go directly from the base to the streets. Cognac, wine, scotch, and always beer and cigarettes. The black market employs thousands of street vendors. American affluence creates resentment among Vietnamese troops and officials. South Vietnam's chief of pacification, Colonel Nguyen Bay.
A colonel like myself get only $70 a month. So at the meantime, an interpreter or a girl who are working for the Americans get at least $200 to $300 a month. And to compare the salary of the president or a minister in the civilian side, get at least only $100 or $150 a month.
Corruption spreads on a huge scale. Often there is little check on government imports. Premier Key investigates. He finds enough cement on order to turn the whole of Vietnam into a concrete platform. Garbage trucks, many are stolen. Vehicle thefts become an industry. Even tanks and helicopters are being sold to the communists. There are brothels outside all large American bases. The girls are usually war refugees. Tens of thousands become prostitutes. In 1966, the U.S. Army reports that 1 in every 4 GIs has venereal disease. For 2.5 million young American men, Vietnam is a part of growing up.
I think the women are too fast for us boys here.
Too fast?
Fast. I don't have any opinion. I'm married. I love them myself.
The military bases are like little America.
Just listen to the music of the traffic in the city.
Hey, you're a Saigon cowboy. You Saigon VC?
For the GIs, the shoeshine boys are an institution. For the street kids, the Americans are a national resource. Parting the GIs from their money is a widespread game. The objective is to shine their shoes if necessary, and get the shirts off their backs if possible.
How much you give it? 40 Shit. I gave it you and tomorrow you don't...
Americans are aware of their cultural impact. An officer who did official studies, Brian Jenkins.
Where the American soldier goes, so goes American culture, but in perhaps never before to the degree that was the case in Vietnam. The wealth of our country, our technology permitted us to carry this to absurd lengths. And the absurdities are numerous. The Armed Forces television station in Vietnam, broadcasting daily the weather reports of the United States.
AFPN presents Bobby and the Weather. Now with reports on weather conditions stateside, Vietnam and R&R, here's that bubbling bundle of barometric brilliance, Bobby.
Now, first in Big D, you long, tall Texans out there had a cool, fair day of 68. Moving down through the Swanee River to the Miami Beach area was a cool, fair day of 77. That's the way the weather has been in our part of the world this evening. This is Bobby saying good night from American Forces Vietnam Network. And this evening, I'd like to send a special salute to the fellas out there of the 92nd Assault Helicopter Company. And thank you, fellas, for watching. Until Monday, have a pleasant evening, weather-wise, and y'all know, of course, otherwise.
Weather. A look at tomorrow's conditions today with Channel 11's weather girl, Bobby.
Miss America goes to Vietnam. All over Vietnam, entertainers follow the combat troops. For young Americans raised on the images of World War II, Vietnam seems unreal. Soldier Jim Webb.
One of the hardest things, for me to really adjust in my mind was to step off of an air-conditioned plane where I just watched a first-run movie, and have this German stewardess say, have a nice war.
In the field, an aerial delivery. Inside, a can of cool beer. The war is unpredictable in its terror and its comforts. Soldier Tim O'Brien.
We had our own personal mascots, for example, or valets. Little kids, 7 or 8, would hook up with a soldier and would wash his socks for him, clean his rifle for him, sometimes carry his rifle for him if we were exceptionally tired that day, dig our foxholes for us at night. It was like a circus in some senses, going through town, going across this beach where the soldiers would be lined up, and then behind us, like a tail on a kite, would be 100, 150 Vietnamese kind of coming along for the ride. I had my assignee, my fellow, I called him Champion was his name, as I recall, a nice kid who would give me a back rub after a hard day on the march, who would clean my rifle for me. This little kid, 7 years old, knew how to take an M16 apart. I didn't.
Friendly relations in one region can change into nightmarish incidents in another. Civilians and guerrillas cannot be told apart.
With the civilians, in many areas of the Anwar Basin, they actively operated against us. And the worst incident that my platoon went through began when an approximately 7-year-old girl lured one of my teams into an ambush, in a North Vietnamese ambush. So we had that level. We had continually to deal with civilians who were either hostile or numb.
In 1966, serious anti-American demonstrations break out in the port city of Da Nang. Premier Key sends in troops to suppress the Buddhist-led protest. Similar demonstrations had led to the overthrow and assassination of President Diem 3 years earlier. Key's forces managed to put down the rebellion. The military command applauds Key for what it calls a solid political victory. But among Americans in Vietnam, there's a growing uneasiness, a feeling they alone are doing the real fighting. By now, 350,000 American troops are in action, mostly along the coastal lowlands and in the foothills north of Saigon. In 1966, 5,000 Americans die in battle. By 1967, Westmoreland claims a major turnabout. He says Americans are now ambushing the communists. But critics begin to accuse Westmoreland of false optimism. In November '67, he visits Washington.
I could quote a number of meaningful statistics, such as the roads that are being opened, increasing number of enemy that have been killed, the number of defectors that are coming in from the communist side of the government, the number of weapons being captured, and other statistical information which suggests that we are making progress and we are winning.
Westmoreland stresses that victory depends on American resolve. He asks for 50,000 more troops. McNamara is strongly against this. President Johnson decides on a first-hand assessment. In December '67, he visits Cam Ranh Bay. Johnson agrees to more troops. Westmoreland's tactics remain unchanged.
But then the tracks that we found in the stream indicate that there was somebody going down this way in the stream. So maybe there's 3 of them. We'll find it. Who's that shooting? Come out! Hey, Sam, drop down a little further over there. The machine guns are going to stay in place. Stay down there around the CP and guard the CP. Take your time and try to toss it right in there. Don't expose yourself too long. Get all the way down. Grenade, hit the ground. That was a good one. That one was dead in there. Hey, don't throw any more grenades in there. That's enough to kill a damn horse. Hey, Scott, get back out the way. Johnson's going in there with a pistol. Look clear.
The U.S. military issues a daily body count. Critics point to conflicting statistics. Victory is claimed, but the war keeps enlarging. Soldier Matt Martin.
That should do it.
They loved high body counts. Well, sometimes you exaggerated a little. And the more regular you were, regular service, regular Marine, regular Army, the higher the body count was. We had a colonel call in, and he was all excited. He said, "What's the body count? What's the body count?" Because we had called in a lot of heavy artillery, you know. We were really putting a job on this one village. So he wanted a real heavy body count. Well, this second Louis we had with us, he had come up through the ranks, and he yelled over 300. So then the radio man said, "You can't give them an even number. They're not going to go for an even number." So he said, "Well, okay, 311. So they called in and said, "We got 311 flat-out deads, sure kills." Well, this officer loved it. He started yelling, "Great, great, did a great job." Well, actually what had happened is one of our Jeeps had turned over and killed this old man. And we had one sure kill because that sucker was dead. And it was an accident, you know.
The Southern Communist guerrillas operate from jungle bases and sympathetic villages. They control half the countryside. North Vietnamese troops are infiltrating in large numbers. By 1967, nearly 200,000 have entered the South. Some form conventional combat units to guard the supply routes. Others blend into the countryside in the South. Inside South Vietnam, they go underground. A network of tunnels is constructed, some extending for a dozen miles. They can hide companies of several hundred men. From the tunnels, they operate in small, highly mobile units. This U.S. Army training film shows American countermeasures. Specially trained GIs called tunnel rats destroy the entrances. The tunnels are intricate with specially constructed bamboo chambers. Hand grenades are often rolled in to close up the entrances. But the tunnels have many exits and explosives have little effect. A later technique uses acetylene gas. The gas is pumped from drums into the tunnel complex. Then detonated by dynamite. This destroys the entire length of the tunnel, but the tunnels account for many communist successes. To sustain the war, North Vietnam is getting massive communist aid. War material from China and the Soviet Union is trucked several hundred miles along border infiltration routes to the fighting zones. During the height of the war, 1966-68, Soviet and Chinese aid is estimated at more than $2 billion, including sophisticated weapons for defense of the North. A senior Hanoi diplomat, Ha Van Lao.
En premier lieu, les pays socialistes.
The socialist countries, the National Liberation Movement, and the forces of peace and justice in the world, including the American people, and above all, the socialist countries aided us materially from a military point of view in order to help us in the resistance against American aggression. We considered this a very important factor in our victory, a factor that can't be overlooked.
The aid funneled south is stockpiled in hundreds of underground shelters. It enables the communists to sustain their hard-hitting mobile tactics. With Russian aid increasing, and with every sign of a long war, Premier Key wants to invade the North. He doubts America's staying power.
American, when you look at their past, they are impatient people. And that I told Mr. Johnson, I told Mr. Nixon many times. If you decide to go to the war, go it fast and quick and win it over. For a frustrated and long-sustained war, 15 years, 10 years, 20 years, you cannot, because you are very impatient people.
Americans in turn express impatience with the South Vietnamese Army, calling its operations search and avoid. U.S. advisors privately describe the South Vietnamese military as 80% ineffective. Americans increasingly believe that South Vietnam is doing little to defend itself. Hundreds of thousands of young South Vietnamese are dodging the draft.
I remember one time going into Da Nang to watch a Bob Hope show. And we were going in on a convoy, all these guys on 6x and all that, and getting into the heart of Da Nang and watching all these kids on Honda motorcycles that were 18, Vietnamese kids, 18 or 19s, and me seeing the day before my buddies getting blown away of saying, hey, what the hell is happening here? These guys invited me, this country invited me over here to fight for their democracy, and yet these guys are running around in Honda motorcycles? What the hell's happening over here?
But Americans continue to support Prime Minister Key. At heart, Key remains a military man. He is flamboyant, blunt, and undiplomatic. He is close to the U.S. commander, Westmoreland, but Key is considered a poor politician. After 2 years in power, he is moved aside by his fellow generals. Key contends undercut by the Americans.
Most of the time during the war, they were trying to do things by themselves. You know, it's very funny and also very tragic that it happened. The Vietnamese communists and the communist world always treat us as a puppet of America. But then American people themselves also consider us as a puppet of America, not a true leaders of the Vietnamese people.
There was a paradox here in which, on the one hand, the leadership of South Vietnam was perceived as the puppets of the Americans by almost everyone except the Americans themselves, who then got none of the benefits of, if they indeed had been puppets, then we could have indeed manipulated them. It was the worst of both worlds, in a sense that they were perceived as puppets and yet could not be manipulated.
The U.S. military wants as many officers as possible to get combat experience. By late 1967, when Premier Key leaves office, 1 million troops have rotated through Vietnam.
A tour for American general or American officers was only 1 year or 2 year maximum. How you can expect them for a short period of just 1 year, 2 years, that they could arrive to understand fully the Vietnamese, not mental, but even they were not able to speak a few words of Vietnamese word. So I can say that the mutual understanding was none, zero.
The By early 1968, U.S. troops are on a broad offensive. There is widespread confidence that the war can be won. The full technology of American firepower is brought to bear. U.S. officials speak of the war being almost over, of seeing light at the end of the tunnel. The guerrilla supply routes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail are being threatened. The southern guerrillas have been driven underground, but in their tunnels, they are planning a major thrust that will prove to be the turning point of the war. Tet. At great cost, 80,000 communist troops attack 100 towns and cities. Washington is dismayed by the ferocity of the offensive. Westmoreland calls the Tet offensive a military failure. He then asks for another 200,000 troops. Critic Arthur Schlesinger.
General Westmoreland's only solution for such thing, for every time he got into more trouble, he asked for more men, culminating the final request after the Tet offensive in 1968. And the kinds of recommendations he made were finally recognized by the United States government as futile.
A military analyst, Brian Jenkins, compiled several official studies on what was wrong.
We may not have won, but we were always in a sense winning, whether one dealt with the body count or whatever aspect of it was, so that these successes were in turn rewarded, or at least there were damn few visible failures. The other part of it, of course, that is that the military success, when there was military success, measured either in geographic terms, occupying something or defeating something, did not translate into political success. People fought over and many died taking hills that meant nothing 3 days later. It wasn't in the sense of that occupying terrain had great meaning.
A month after Tet, Westmoreland is removed from command and promoted to Chief of Staff. President Johnson freezes troop levels. Former Assistant Secretary of Defense, Paul Nietzsche.
Well, I know him to be an absolutely outstanding man. A man of great character and honor. So that isn't the question at issue. The question at issue is whether he was as subtle a general and as wise in his dispositions and in his actions as one could have hoped for.
His military predictions were wrong, and his military strategy was wrong. He was trying to fight a war of attrition, of large units, a conventional war against guerrillas. I think it can be said that General Westmoreland was the most disastrous American general since Custer.
And throughout the war, we never lost a battle. We had some companies that were badly hurt through ambushes and associated with combat actions, but we did not lose a battle of consequence. In my opinion, by early, during the 68, 69 time frame, we had as fine a military force as America has ever assembled. A force that could have brought the war to an end if it hadn't been for political decisions that prohibited that.
After Tet, the American public grows weary of Vietnam. There is widespread belief that South Vietnam should fight their own war. But the South Vietnamese Army continually fails in combat. Many South Vietnamese leaders blame this failure on U.S. military policy. Former Ambassador to Washington, Viet Cong.
I think that there are millions of South Vietnamese who were willing to bear their own responsibilities in waging the war. And if they had been asked, and if one can explain to them what they have to do, I would say that they would do the job willingly.
But by the time South Vietnam begins to take over the war, the South Vietnam-American alliance is severely strained. The Vietnam War is seen by many Americans as a tragic error. As military commander, General Westmoreland is viewed as a major author of this mistake.
Well, of course, I've read Kipling, and I'm very fond of him because he's kind of the soldier's poet. The end of the fight is a tombstone white with the name of the late deceased. And the epitaph, drear, a fool lies here who tries to hustle the East. And having read Kipling, I was aware of that, and I didn't take it quite to heart. I was center stage, and the war became considerably unpopular, and needless to say, a lot of that rubbed off on me. I was not elated with some of the venom that was cast my way, but as a soldier prays for peace, he must be prepared to cope with the hardships of war and bear its scars. And I have borne figuratively scars.
Between 1965 and 68, 30,000 American troops die in Vietnam. Westmoreland leaves Vietnam July 68. American strategy then centers on the means of withdrawal. The policy is called Vietnamization, handing back the war to the South Vietnamese. But ending the war takes 4 years.
I gave the effort to the best that I had, an effort born of experience in 2 other wars and many years in uniform. I did my utmost to carry out my duties loyally and conscientiously and professionally. And with the satisfaction of knowing that I conducted myself that way, I have no regrets, and I have nothing to apologize for.